Hello friends, so here we are getting toward the end of our journey through the ratios. We've talked about growth ratios, profitability ratios, efficiency ratios, liquidity ratios, and now we are at the point of looking at leverage. Okay, so when we talk about leverage, just imagine, a leverage is this kind of, this fulcrum thing, right? This where you have, let me see if I can describe this. Maybe you have this little memory of physics class, right, where you had, okay, let's get a line here. Okay, so just go with me, right? So in this example, right, leverage would be, this is highly levered in terms of, if I was to, just imagine that I'm a good artist and that this is this all makes sense. Let's make that brown, just for going with our theme here. All right, so if I have this big rock right down here at the bottom, or this big piece of wood, and I have this pole, and I have this fulcrum right in the middle, and when I push down on this pole, I have a lot of leverage because a lot of weight is going to be transferred on this side to shift this ball up. Now, conversely, if I had it the other way around, right? So something like this, then I have to put a lot of weight, because now I'm having to transfer, one, I have to push this pole up, and two, I have to increase this this ball into the air, right? So same kind of concept as the old physics lessons. We're kind of looking to say, well, how much debt do we have, and is that a good or a bad thing? Because in our fulcrum example, too much debt could break the pole, right? Too much leverage could break the pole, trying to move the weight. In our example, too much debt could be a bad thing. It could break the business. So let's look through at a couple of ways to view that. So debt ratio, if we looked over here to the right hand side, it's going to say our interest-bearing debt plus leases, right, divided by our interest-bearing debt plus leases plus equity. So that looks kind of complex. You could really just say debt divided by total assets, right? I mean, you could really be just that simple. You could also say long-term debt divided by total assets, because that's really, the long-term debt is what we're using to actually finance, capital structure of our business. So we're going to do this a little bit outside of what they say. One, we don't have itemized leases here, right? So capital leases is especially what they're talking about. We don't have that. So we're just going to take our long-term debt here, and we're going to divide that by our long-term debt. So sum of our long-term debt plus, not plus, long-term debt and equity, right? And we take that, and it tells us that we have a debt ratio. Let's put it in a percentage form, knock it out by one decimal. And now let's just go and look at this. We have 105, right, in debt, and we have 481 in equity. So we add those together, we get 586, right? So we're basically saying debt is roughly 18% of our kind of invested capital structure. Okay, so the next one is going to be our debt to equity ratio. And debt to equity ratio is going to be looking at our interest-bearing debt. And so again, just for simplicity, we're going to look at just our long-term debt. And we could dive into that a little bit more with a little bit more complex methods as well, but we're going to keep it simple for right now. Interest-bearing debt, so long-term debt, and we're just going to divide that by the equity, right? So we don't look at it in terms of our as a percentage of the overall invested capital, but we're saying, how much debt is there compared to our equity? And here we're saying is pretty low, right? And now we look at our equity to asset ratio, and the equity to assets is really straightforward. It's just saying our equity divided by our total assets, which is the same thing as our liabilities and equity. So there we kind of flip some formulas on their head, and we see that it's 69%, right? So 69% of our total assets is equity, and that's a good thing if you have a lot of ownership in the business. But it can also mean that a little bit more debt could help out the business, or could it? So let's look at our some other views of that to see, well, is this an appropriate amount of debt or not? So we can look at our time interest earned first of all, and that's where we're going to look at our EBIT. So EBIT is our operating profit, so before we pay interest and taxes, and we can divide that by our interest. Now what that tells us, let's put that in this one decimal to the right. We have 7 times interest expense in EBIT. So our operating profit is 7 times as high as our interest expense. So that means that operationally we have a lot of money we could use to pay off debt, right? Now we can take that one step further and say, well, times interest earned from a cash flow perspective. Now one thing to note, if you're looking at these operational costs, we have depreciation in here. Depreciation, just a quick reminder, is not cash that we're paying out. It's basically the government says, we know that for the assets that you buy, right down here in our assets, fixed assets, that you are using them to produce, and that's taking away the marketable value of them, or even the book value of them. And so the government lets you write this off over a time period, okay? And so here our depreciation is not a cash expense, so we can add that back actually to find out what our times interest is earned is from a cash flow perspective. And why is that important? Well, why it's important is because there are lots of different depreciation styles. So by adding that back, we can kind of level the playing field and find out, well, does a company versus another company have a more or less operational cash flows to pay off its debt? So again, take that and we divide it by our interest expense, and there we have it. So 11 times, and that's positive, right? That's a lot better than what we had. All right. And then we have our times burden covered, right? And this one is going to get a little bit more complex. And basically, here's what we're going to do. So basically what we're going to do on this one is, first let's look at the formula, all right, because it's a little bit complex. Where is it? Here. So it's our EBIT, right? So again, we're taking our operational ability to pay off debt. And we're saying not just interest, but the overall payment that we have to make. So if you think about when you make a house payment, right, you're paying off to the bank a flat amount. So maybe you take out you get a $100,000 loan or something like that to buy a house, and your monthly payment might be $1,000. Well, out of that $1,000, at first, something like $600, $700, $800 per month is going to go to the bank. The rest of that is going to go to paying off the actual debt, right? So paying off that $100,000 note. And over time, that's going to change because that $200 is taken away from the $100,000, and then that goes down from $100,000 to $99,800, right? And it keeps on chunking that away, and the interest as a portion of what you owe also changes, right? So it just kind of mixes across. And so here we don't have that level of granularity, but the way we can do it is take our EBIT, right? So it's our operational profit, and we can just sum what we're paying in interest with what our current portion of the long-term debt is. And that current portion of long-term debt is what we owe on our long-term debt down here, right? So we're paying off a flat amount of 8 per month, or 8 per year in this case. And that will give us this 4 point, let's put it in the right format, our 4.6. So in other words, we have 4.6 times our overall payments in operational cash flow. And now we can copy that over to the right, and we can see that it wasn't always so healthy. Right, in 2004 it looked good. Then we had some periods where we just didn't have a lot of operational cash flow to cover our obligations. Again, up here, our time interest earned, 1.7, slightly over 1.7, slightly over 1.2. We could barely have enough operational cash flow to pay off our debts, right? And again, you look up here, our debt to equity ratio. We stacked on more debt during this time period. One of the key questions we would want to ask ourselves is why? What was that debt used for, right? Our equity was decreasing, so because we're taking on more debt. Our time interest earned was going down. In other words, operationally, we weren't making as much money, so we had more debt. We had more debt. We weren't making as much money. We were having less ability to pay off our obligations. So these were kind of concerning factors. All right, so we're going to take a break from this, and then we'll come back and close this out with risk ratios.